This podcast contains explicit language. If you want to know how explicit, keep listening. Hi, I'm Josh Levin, and this is Hang Up and Listen for the week of May 15th, 2023. On this week's show, the Washington Post's Ben Golliver will be here to talk about the Sixers Game 7 choke and other NBA playoff happenings. Meg Rowley of FanGraphs and Effectively Wild will also join us to talk about the horribleness of the Oakland A's and the magnificence of the Tampa Bay Rays. And finally, Sarah Lyall of the New York Times will discuss her role as America's greatest dog show reporter. Westminster just happened. We'll get into it. I'm in Washington, D.C., and I'm the author of The Queen and the host of the podcast 1 Year. Also in D.C. is Stefan Fatsis. He's the author of the books Word Freak, A Few Seconds of Panic, and Wild and Outside. Hello, Stefan.
Love the dog show. I'm so glad we are doing the dog show for the first time in the history of this podcast, I think.
Is this the last thing we'll do for the first time on the podcast?
No, there are many more frontiers to conquer, Josh.
Like maybe the Sixers winning in the Eastern Conference semifinals, maybe next year.
Yeah, maybe.
Joel Anderson is off working on Slow Burn Season 8, becoming Justice Thomas. May 31st, 2 weeks from now. Can't wait. In our Slate Plus segment, Meg Rowley of FanGraphs and Effectively Wild will stick around to talk to us about baseball rules. We'll dismiss the pitch clock in the beginning. We're going to get to the next level stuff. Resetting the batting lineup. How are they going to get rid of all the strikeouts? We'll talk about rules changes 8.6. To hear us discuss that, you need to be a Slate Plus member. You get bonus segments on this show, on other Slate shows. You get to listen to us ad-free, and you get to support us, which we appreciate. Slate.com/hangupplus to sign up. That's slate.com/hangupplus. On Sunday, Michael Levin, one of the hosts of the Rights to Ricky Sanchez podcast, tweeted the following: "The two best words in sports, Game 7. The two worst words in sports, the Sixers." Great tweet. And the thing that makes it even better is that it went out 3 hours before tip-off of Philly's 112-88 loss to Boston on Sunday, a game in which Jason Tatum was amazing. Your current NBA MVP, Joel Embiid, was terrible. James Harden was also terrible. And Doc Rivers came out the loser for the 10th time in a Game 7 as a head coach, 5 more than anyone else. Or if you prefer multiplication, twice as many as anyone else. Back with us this week is Ben Golliver. You can read him in the Washington Post and listen to him on the fabulous Greatest of All Talk podcast. Thanks for showing up, Ben. Very un-Sixers-like of you.
Yeah, no, I'm glad to be here. Hang up, maybe the two greatest words in sports. How about that?
Thank you. That's going on the logo. The, what do you call that, Stefan? The icon?
Yeah, you can call it whatever you want to call it. We're going to make T-shirts. Ben Golliver, hang up, whatever you said.
One could argue that the Sixers actually overachieved, Ben, by making it to a Game 7, given that the Celtics were the higher seed. Will you dare on this planet, on this day, to argue that the Philadelphia 76ers are overachievers?
Wow, that's quite the take. I don't think anyone in Philly would agree with you. I think those Sixers diehards you're quoting earlier are probably having a hard time getting out of bed this morning. I think the frustrating part for the entire experience is that they made it to Game 7 because they finally got enough help around Joel Embiid to go deep in a series against a quality opponent. Now, since Embiid's been there, they've never beaten a 50-win team in a playoff series. Their only victories are, typically first-round wins against teams that sometimes are even below 500. So they get 2 40-point performances from James Harden in wins. They get Boston laying a complete egg in the middle of the series, giving them a win in Game 5. And they have this golden opportunity back at home in Game 6 to take care of business and close the door. And Joel Embiid just can't deliver. And then they get another chance in Game 7. And it wasn't just the foreboding fans who were, preparing for doom in Game 7. I mean, there's leaking reports about, referee disparities before Game 7. They're almost trying to lay the groundwork just in case this thing goes awry. And, we've seen that from the Sixers before. In 2021, Doc Rivers had a very ominous pregame press conference before Game 7 against the Hawks, where he essentially said he hoped his team didn't choke. And sure enough, they went out there and did. So I don't think the vibes were very good going into Game 7. And the way they rolled over, I got to say, it wasn't super surprising to me. Draymond Green has coined this idea of the 82-game player versus the 16-game player. And typically, among the NBA players, they love to celebrate the 16-game guys, the players who raise their games in the postseason, but they don't love to point the finger at the 82-game players, the guys who, maybe they're better in the regular season and can't quite translate their skills to the playoffs. And I think right now, among the superstar class, there is no clearer 82-game player than Joel Embiid. He's just not the same guy in the playoffs, whether it's for health reasons, whether it's because his offensive game isn't as effective against high-level defenses, and whether his defensive limitations in terms of going out and playing in space and not being quite as versatile as the very best playoff defenders like Anthony Davis, they all came back to bite the Sixers in this series, and he got plenty of help to win this series in 6 or 7 games, and ultimately he didn't step up and bring it home.
Help us understand, though, what happened in Game 7, Ben, because they played well in the first half, the Sixers did. This was a close game, and then they scored 10 points in the third quarter, which was the lowest, I think, in the history of the NBA playoffs in the shot clock era. I mean, part of it was Jason Tatum exploding and not missing anything and finishing with 51 points to set a Game 7 playoff record a few days after Seth Curry had set the Game 7 playoff record with 50 points. But something else...
That would be Steph Curry, Seth's brother.
But something like what happened in that quarter?
Well, they fell to pieces, and I think there's a couple different reasons for it. First of all, I have this phrase, it's not always about you, bro, right? Like sometimes it's just about Jason Tatum, scored 51 points, and whatever happened, to your own offense would be irrelevant. But I think a big part of it is mental. They've been in a number of these collapses before. Doc Rivers' closeout game record is not excellent. Joel Embiid has not had that signature moment in the playoffs of confidence boosting, of being able to get over the hump. And the Celtics have haunted the Sixers. Joel Embiid, and for decades, frankly, before Joel Embiid was even there, have really struggled in that matchup. It's a tough matchup for Philadelphia because Boston shoots the three so well, and because they've got arguably the best Embiid stopper in the NBA right now in Al Horford, who played sensational defense across this series, limiting Joel Embiid, confusing him, frustrating him, kind of coaxing him into turnovers. And I think you could see their confidence wane from there. Philly, to me, their energy, especially Embiid and Harden, wasn't great even to start the game as those two teams were feeling each other out. But coming out in the third quarter, it was clear Boston was ready to switch into sixth gear. Philadelphia couldn't keep up with them, and it was really their offense that fell apart. They weren't getting good shots. There was turnover issues. The ball movement wasn't great. It was a lot of stagnant jumpers, just one shot and no rebounds, and back they go the other way. And it just got to a point where it was demoralizing, and that's what you have to guard against if you're a team with a checkered playoff past, because as soon as it starts to slip, you get that feeling of like, oh boy, here we go again. And that's exactly what you saw from Harden and Embiid, where the effort down the stretch and the production down the stretch was just not close to what we would think of as their, regular season standard.
For a man who accused me of firing off a spicy take in the intro, I was genuinely taken aback when you did that whole run up with the 82-game player thing and said Joel Embiid instead of James Harden. Like I was, whoa, I actually didn't see that coming. And didn't we see in Game 6, Ben, that just a tiny shift or a twist of fate changed the whole narrative from Joel Embiid gets the Sixers into the Eastern Conference Finals, and maybe he'd have a just absolutely rip-roaring, amazing series against the Heat. I mean, I don't know if that, Bam might have something to say about that. But then you have Jason Tatum put up one of the worst performances in an elimination game ever until halfway through the fourth quarter, and then comes back with the greatest Game 7 in terms of points ever. So are you saying that just like, are you just being descriptive of like Joel Embiid hasn't won in the playoffs, which I think we can agree with? Or are you saying there is something wrong with Joel Embiid?
Well, this is a little bit of a hobby horse of mine because throughout his tenure in Philadelphia, there's been a lot of scapegoats. Brett Brown became a scapegoat, got himself fired after the bubble. Ben Simmons, maybe the biggest scapegoat of the last 25 years at the NBA. And surely he had his shortcomings in the playoffs too. But if you consistently go series by series, Joel Embiid has had injury issues that have impacted his team's ability to win games. He's had these mysterious illnesses during series where people just don't know whether they can count on him. He's had a lot of duds, low efficiency scoring performances in closeout and elimination games. And I've long felt that he's the best player. He's the max salary player. He's in his prime. Typically, when we assess blame after series losses, those types of players get it first. And in Philadelphia, he's such a charming guy. People love this idea of, the modern Shaq from a personality standpoint, and he's funny on Twitter with the trolling. People seem to like him, and I've always felt he's just a little bit Teflon. He's sort of escaped criticism more often maybe than he should in postseasons past. I do think that changed this year. I do think people started to realize, like, wait a minute, the nature of his game isn't ideally conducive to postseason basketball. I'll give you a couple examples. The best thing that he does, he's the NBA scoring leader, right? He's a great mid-range shooter. He's great at getting to the free throw line, and he's great at kind of punishing smaller defenders, going towards the basket during the regular season. As you progress through the playoffs, all of those things get more challenging. You're facing more double teams, so you don't get these wide open mid-range jumpers. You're not, going against these oversized centers who you can just plow to the hoop because, you've got to deal with Al Horford and Robert Williams and the Boston's wings. You've got to deal with more traps and doubles that are trying to confuse you and take the ball out of your hands, right? And then you're not getting to the free throw line as much as we saw that really dried up in this series because, if you're just trying to foul bait or making that a huge part of your game, you're at the mercy and the whims of the referees, and sometimes you don't get the calls. So his scoring average has gone way down in the postseason compared to the regular season, consistently over his career. And that's a big problem because that's one of his chief strengths. And then I would just say quickly on the defensive side, he had some amazing rim protection moments in this series, especially considering his knee injury. Like, to be able to get up, to have the timing, to trust your, wobbly knee, and really contest people above the rim is a huge asset for a defense. And it's something that you would expect to kind of go away if he was dealing with a significant knee injury, just because of, the strain, both mentally and physically, on a player in those spots. He was able to get it done around the basket quite a bit. And if you look at how they played defense without him in game one compared to when he was back on the court in game two, from an interior defense standpoint, Philadelphia was much better. But what you saw in Game 7 was the perimeter attack with Jason Tatum leading the way from the three-point shot, but also Al Horford stepping out and taking threes, Jaylen Brown, Marcus Smart, all of Boston's shooters. Joel Embiid does not have a significant defensive impact against those kinds of players, and he wasn't great in pick-and-roll situations either because he's not the most mobile player. He wants to sit in the paint and contest those shots, but in the modern NBA, this is a wing-dominated league. It's a three-point-dominated league, and Jason Tatum is getting Embiid switched out to him on the perimeter and just looking at him like he's dinner. He's licking his lips and shooting three-pointers right over the top of him, and I think that, you see the effectiveness both defensively and offensively decrease in the postseason for Joel Embiid. And I don't think it's just a matter of he has to go back in the gym and, work a little bit harder and fix that. These are just sort of who he is as this giant man, this 7-footer, nearly 300-pound player. Those are some of the things that you have to live with, I think, if you're the Philadelphia 76ers, and you have to work around. And unfortunately, they've consistently hit walls in large part because Embiid has those limitations.
Wow. James Harden sucked. Are we overlooking that? And he has sucked in elimination games many times before.
Let me say this. The great thing about the Sixers is you can blame everyone and you'll be right. James Harden absolutely came up small. His fourth quarter numbers in games 5, 6, and 7, I'm sure people have realized, I don't think he scored in the fourth quarter of those 3 games. But my only point here is this. Harden's always going to get criticism. Doc Rivers is a very easy target, but it is time in this life cycle of the Sixers for people to look a little bit more closely at Embiid. And I think they've started to do that. And remember, James Harden's not in his prime. James Harden wasn't an all-star this year. James Harden isn't on a max salary. James Harden might not be there next year, right? So if you're really trying to, quote-unquote, fix the Philadelphia 76ers, blaming James Harden and scapegoating James Harden is going to be about as effective as scapegoating Ben Simmons and getting yourself stuck into that quagmire, right? I think what you've really got to do is look hard at what Embiid is capable of doing in the playoffs, and then finding the right mix of players who can kind of offset some of those shortcomings if you eventually want to get over the hump.
That was a command performance. I've got it. Ben is like taking a drink right now because he deserves it. You can sit on the bench for the next 30 seconds, but we're going to have you come back to the scorers table. I think in the West, I think the thing that was most surprising, and you hit on this on your piece in the Post about the Lakers beating the Warriors in 6, was how normal it looked. They didn't have to do anything extraordinary. LeBron was great in Game 6, but like great for LeBron now is 30. Like he scored 30. And they scored 122. Like, it wasn't just the LeBron show the entire game. And, this is a team that has gone from, being 2-10 at the start of the year, being bad to mediocre long beyond that, being down double digits in the play-in, to now just kind of strolling past the Warriors. What?
Well, can I ask you guys on the Warriors side of this thing? Because I was stunned to see them go out so quietly, right? Because the only 2 times previously we've seen them lose, in 2016, Draymond's getting the suspension, and it's just this disastrous collapse. Nobody's ever seen it before. It's one of the messiest losses in NBA history, right? Fast forward to 2019, for a very different reason, the injuries to Kevin Durant and Klay Thompson. That felt like a nuclear bomb being in the building, right? It's like, oh my God, dynasty's over. I'm sure I wrote that column right afterwards. Like, it was just this explosive loss. And then it was, a whimpering exit for the Warriors against the Lakers, right? Where they were just kind of quietly dominated. LeBron was able to do his thing. Anthony Davis sort of controlled the latter stages of the series defensively. It turned out that head injury was, a complete false alarm. He was fine, came right back and played great. And the Warriors weren't able to get good shots. Klay Thompson didn't come through Game 6 Klay. Draymond Green was outplayed in his matchup, and Steph Curry was good, but not transcendent. It was this very quiet finish, and they sort of accepted it. And they looked around, and Draymond even said, wow, it's been a long time since we've been out of the playoffs in May. And then he was starting to plan his podcast and media ventures for the summer. And I was like, what is going on? This isn't the Golden State Warriors I know. Was it weird to you guys? Did you have the same feeling watching them kind of whimper out of the playoffs? It's like very out of character for this group, right?
It was a little sort of just boring. There was when they got down double digits in Game 6, you did not think that they were going to come back. And I don't know when the last time I felt that they weren't going to come back was. And part of that had to do with how well the Lakers were shooting and how much LeBron was controlling the game. And when Austin Reeves makes that half-court shot to end the first half, I thought, this is done.
Well, you just come to expect that from Austin Reeves at this point. I mean, the Kings series, which we've talked about extensively, was operatic in terms of the ups and downs in the series and within games. But also, Ben, I mean, we talk about the Warriors not having lost to the Western Conference team and, all of the kind of accomplishments. But a thing that's perhaps underplayed is that when you're just blowing teams out in the playoffs and you're so reliant on guys like Steph and Klay who are just running around the whole game, then it allows you to save up energy for maybe some of your tougher matchups and maybe stave off injury, except in the case that you talked about against the Raptors. But in this case, the Kings, I mean, it required every last drop of their effort. They weren't a 1 seed. Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess that didn't necessarily help some teams in these playoffs. But, that if you're expending every last drop of energy to get out of the first round, and then, it leaves you maybe with what we saw in Game 6.
And maybe you're expending all that energy too, and you are in your mid-30s. I mean, Steve Kerr was optimistic after the game, and maybe he has to be, saying they've got plenty left in the tank. They've got a lot to offer. They're still high-level players. I still feel like this team has championship potential, but they're another year older without Kevin Durant as the anchor or the fourth. He wouldn't be the fourth Beatle, but he wouldn't be Ringo, but he was, he's just not there. And the people that you hoped would step up to fill that role also didn't seem to be there during this series for the Warriors. So will they, is Kerr just saying that because he's got to say nice things during the exit interview? Or does he really believe that Draymond, Clay, and Steph are still the core and can win again next year?
Well, I think you guys made some great points. I mean, look no further than after that Game 7, the emotional Game 7, they come and immediately drop Game 1, right? Mm-hmm. And it's like the turnaround was too quick, and that put the Lakers in charge of that series, and they never let go of it. So we got to give a lot of credit to the Lakers here for just managing and handling that series brilliantly. And when they've been at home in the postseason, the Lakers are undefeated, and they're winning by a blowout margin every single time. And so, as much as they whimpered out towards the end, I really do think it was the slow start to the series that probably caught up to the Warriors and cost them. And I agree with your points, both on the age and on just the exhaustion factor of taking too long to put away Sacramento. In terms of the Warriors going forward, there absolutely was a feel in the room of like this orchestrated effort to tamp down the most, the craziest theories about what was going to happen to the Warriors, right? Steve Kerr says our core has, more championship basketball left in them. Draymond Green said, I want to, ride out with the same guys I rode in with. And in other words, he wants to be a Warrior for life and stay with Steph and Clay. And they're in a situation where replacing any of those guys or trading those guys for value, given the size of their contracts, is really difficult to do. But they're also in a situation where they're going to need to position themselves for these new collective bargaining agreement rules, which are targeted at high-spending teams like them. So there's going to need to be some trimming. I didn't hear a lot of talk about Jordan Poole as part of the core. Jordan Poole is going to be here for the next decade and take the baton from Steph. And so I think if there's somebody to keep an eye on from a trade perspective or who might be departing this summer, I would circle Jordan Poole. But there's going to be negotiations both with Draymond Green and potentially Klay Thompson to try to keep those guys in town. And it could be a situation similar to James Harden last year with Philly, where that negotiation says, hey, you can have some more years, but we've got to bring that annual salary number down so that we can kind of fill out our rotation and get better help. Because one reason why Steph ran into the ground against the Lakers is he really didn't have a lot of other sources he could turn to for offense. Jordan Poole was non-existent. The bench players were very spotty. They might get a good quarter here and there from Dante DiVincenzo, but they just did not have the depth and the balance. And it was crazy to see the Lakers outshoot them from the three-point line from a percentage standpoint in the last game. It really felt like a full circle moment. I don't know if you guys remember on opening night, LeBron lost to the Warriors in San Francisco, and he came out with this, great line about it's not like we've got a lot of lasers on our team, talking about how the Lakers were so lacking in outside shooting. And it was a jab right at the front office. It's kind of a sideways jab at Westbrook, too, for not being a great shooter and a great fit. And, fast forward 6 months, they remake the roster, they find more sources of shooting, and they're out shooting the very same Golden State Warriors in the final game of Golden State's title defense. It's pretty crazy to see how quickly that flipped 180 degrees from the start of the season to the end of the season.
That's a great point. And yeah, let's wrap up quickly with the two teams that we haven't mentioned yet. And when you were talking about Embiid and the 82-game player and the 16-game player thing, the two players that immediately leap to mind for me are Jokic, his rival for MVP honors and as the dominant center in the league, and Jimmy Butler, who is the number one example of the 16-game player. I know you're really bullish on the Nuggets, but maybe if you could say a few words about those players or those teams.
Well, look, Denver is a sleeping giant to this point, right? Probably not getting as much attention, as many eyeballs as the Warriors and Lakers series, as they just sort of dismantled the Phoenix Suns and left them for dead, frankly. I mean, it was not a pretty ending to that series either. With Jokic, he's never been better. This is peak Jokic you're going to be seeing in this playoffs from just a dominance standpoint, from a playmaking standpoint, from his own ability to score and understand when teams are daring him to be a scorer and trying to take away his incredible passing ability. He will punish you more quickly, more forcefully, and more efficiently than at any other point of his career. And he's just so fun to watch, right? there's been a lot of focus in this the Western Conference Finals previews of Jokic, the best offensive player right now in the league, and Anthony Davis, the best defensive player in the league. I actually think the X factor for this matchup is going to be Jamal Murray. Jamal Murray is crucial to keeping Denver's pace high, to keeping them playing great basketball at home, to keeping the ball flowing and finding Denver's other shooters. And he's had a field day in the first month of the playoffs because he hasn't had anybody who can even try to guard him. You go back to the Minnesota Timberwolves, that's not their strength, backcourt defense at all. They had no answers for him. And the Phoenix Suns, I mean, defense was never really their strong suit with this new group. But once they lost Chris Paul to injury, once they started shifting more towards offensive-oriented lineups, they had nobody who could stop Jamal Murray, and he was consistently scoring at a high level to support Jokic, right? The defensive game plan against Denver is always going to be try to make them more one-dimensional. You got to take away either Jokic's passing or Jokic's scoring, and then you're going to be able to handle them a little bit better. And when you look at the Lakers' defensive personnel, they've got much better guards, and much longer guards, more physical guards, but also just annoying guys like Dennis Schroeder that they can throw on Murray. And so to me, that's the hinge matchup of this whole series. If he can score like he did in the two previous rounds, Denver's so good at home, and they have the number one postseason offense. They have home court advantage. They should be able to get this done. But if the Lakers can bring Murray back to earth and kind of put more burden on Jokic and put more burden on Denver's less experienced from a playoff standpoint supporting cast, the Lakers can take this series. It's going to be an amazing matchup. Number one playoff defense versus number one playoff offense. Joker versus Anthony Davis inside. This LeBron, can he make a push for the fifth ring while he's kind of chilling in third or fourth gear? There are so many storylines going into this thing, but to me, the player who will ultimately decide the series one way or the other is Jamal Murray.
And Jimmy Butler just taking that last answer as fuel for his championship run. Ben Golliver, you can read him in the Washington Post, listen to him on the Greatest of All Talk podcast. Ben, thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. And I did not mean to shortchange Jimmy Butler because I gave him his first national cover story at Sports Illustrated. He, of any player who kind of shares a life philosophy in terms of consistency and pounding opponents and just always wanting to be locked in, I feel like I've always had a bond with Jimmy. I'm not surprised at all he's back in the conference finals, but I don't think he has enough this year to overcome the Celtics' depth, and I hope he takes that as fire and shocks the world again.
Up next, FanGraphs' Meg Rowley on the bad A's and the good Rays.
After beating the New York Yankees on Sunday, the Tampa Bay Rays have a 31-11 record. They're the best in pitching and hitting and however else you measure goodness in baseball, but it may not last because being the wire-to-wire 1984 Detroit Tigers is hard. At the other end of the game, the Oakland A's are 9-33 and are the worst in pitching and hitting and however else you measure badness in baseball. And that is more likely to last because this team seems to suck in historic ways. Meg Rowley is the managing editor of FanGraphs and the co-host with Ben Lindbergh of the podcast Effectively Wild. Welcome back to the show, Meg.
Thanks for having me.
All right, people are comparing the A's unfavorably to the 1962 New York Mets, who finished with a modern era worst record of 40-120. Jason Stark in The Athletic recently quoted an anonymous team executive who said, "I honestly think that's the worst team I've ever watched in my career." How bad are the A's, Meg, and why are they so bad?
They're pretty bad. They are in some ways astonishingly bad. It is May 15th. We're still in the early going here, right? We haven't quite hit the quarter mark. They have a negative 157 run differential as we're recording today. You have to try to be that bad, and I think that that's an important thing for folks to keep in mind when it comes to the Athletics. This is very much by design, right? This is a team that has systematically traded away any good young player that it has had that has come remotely close to costing money. And the returns for those trades haven't been particularly good, right? There's a model for doing this. We might find it distasteful, but there's a version of this that works where you have a very hard payroll limit. You trade guys away as they get expensive, but you're really good at drafting. You're really good at development. You have a state-of-the-art front office, and you're able to cobble together a team that, despite your, minuscule payroll, is competitive. That is not what Oakland is doing here. The returns for those trades haven't been particularly good. The amount of money that they're spending on the big league roster is laughable. And this is what we're getting as a result. Like, this team probably didn't anticipate only winning 9 games so far, but they didn't anticipate winning many. And they are, in some ways, having a very successful season. They're just setting goals that are wildly out of sync with what we would want as people who enjoy baseball.
Matt Olson, Matt Chapman, Chris Bassett, Sean Murphy, some of the players that were in Oakland and are no longer there. This is a franchise that, if you think back to the original Moneyball teams, those were successful, famously, with low payrolls. But if we also think back to those teams getting broken up, and then they were successful again, and then that team, the 2012 to 2014 A's, that were really successful, they took a dip, and then they were successful again.
Right.
From 2018 to 2021, I think the hallmark of those rebuilds was probably flipping guys and getting those good returns and decent returns. And you would think that the A's front office would know how to value these players and would know, which prospects to ask for and get in return. And so the question is, did they get a lot dumber, or did they not get good returns on purpose, or is something else happening?
I mean, I do think that we have to reckon with the fact that Oakland is behind when it comes to, the front office infrastructure that we would think of as putting a team that isn't going to spend money in a position to succeed. Like, you think about a team like the Rays, which we'll talk about, and they, don't run a payroll quite as small as Oakland's, but they're really good at drafting. They're really good at development. Their internal assessments of players are excellent. And so while they don't win every trade, I think that sometimes we laud the Rays a little too much. We attribute a little too much success to them when it comes to their trade acumen, but they are able to do those successful assessments. I remember when Oakland traded Sean Murphy, the Brewers somehow insinuated themselves into that trade, ended up coming out with William Contreras. And the big haul for Oakland was Echeverri Ruiz, who, he's a fun player in a lot of ways. He steals a lot of bases. His defense is good. But the sort of general consensus within the industry was that he was maybe a 4th outfielder. Now, he's going to be a starting outfielder for Oakland, and he'll probably end up being one of their better players just by default. But when you're looking at a situation like that, where you have a player like Sean Murphy, who is making a reasonable case for NL MVP right now, and you, the team that previously employed him, are not getting the best player back in the trade, I think we have to ask questions about what their internal assessments are like. Some of this is just a matter of not spending money on the other end. You don't have to spend as much money on front office personnel. They're not making what players make in free agency, but it takes money to staff a front office. It takes money to have the technological infrastructure you need to really assess players. And that's another place where Oakland has demonstrated they're not really willing to spend, and they are pretty far behind now. So I think that if you're going to do this, right, if you're going to trade away guys as they get expensive, you have to have the infrastructure in place and the personnel in place to really make that work. And I think that that is probably an underreported aspect of Oakland's last couple of years, which is how far behind they've fallen on that score.
Yeah, I mean, Stefan, if you, I think if you were to ask any of us, 20 years ago, or just to say the A's will still employ Billy Beane in 2023, and they will be considered one of the teams that's furthest behind in baseball analytically. I think both of those things would be very surprising.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was surprising that Billy Beane, as we saw in the movie Moneyball, stayed in Oakland when he could have gone to Boston and certainly had other offers, and that he's endured. But I don't know that we can divorce any of this, Meg, from the ownership of this team. They are in chaos.
Yeah.
There are negotiations with the city of Oakland that have been going on for years and years for a new site for a stadium. Collapsed. They've flirted with Vegas and said they have land, and then they said, oops, that land, maybe not, but now we've got another property that we think will be less taxpayer dependent. It's not clear that they're going to go anywhere or will be able to go anywhere. This is incompetent ownership, it seems, to allow both the chaos from the franchise location to occur and to allow the team to disintegrate to this embarrassing state. They're drawing 3,000-4,000 people a game
right.
in Oakland. That's insane.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right that this really starts and ultimately can only stop with ownership. If you are unwilling to spend money on your club, if you're unwilling to maintain a ballpark just to basic major league standards, right? We got a good laugh out of the fact that there was a possum in the visiting broadcaster booth. That's embarrassing. That's embarrassing for the team, and that's embarrassing for the league. You think about all of the players, the incredible teams that have played there, and this is where we are. You don't get there without either gross negligence on the part of ownership or a very purposeful plan to make the situation in Oakland untenable. And that they have done that and not fully secured an option to go to Vegas is just baffling to me. It's like, if you're gonna, sneak out of town in the middle of the night and go to a place where you think they have better marks, you better have the mark secured, right? Like, this is just a completely baffling situation on their part, particularly since this was a team that was a playoff team in recent memory, right? We just don't have to do it this way. And the fans in Oakland deserve a lot better than what they're getting, because they might not be showing up in droves, and who can blame them? But the ones who are there are very passionate and I think quite clear-eyed about the situation that they're in. And, this lies at John Fisher's feet.
The possum in the broadcast booth, I'm glad you brought that up, because there is something kind of old-timey about that. I mean, there's this long and storied tradition in baseball
of rabies shots for announcers.
But of teams not being up to major league standards in various ways, or ballparks not being up to major league standards. But it's something, I, as a kid, would read these books of amazing sports, wacky anecdotes.
Yeah.
And just it seems like something that would be written about the Baker Bowl or so, one of these stadiums from the early 1900s. But I think in all pro sports, there's been a kind of homogenization and a sort of level of standard that's one of, I think, the successes, I guess you would call it, in modern sports, that franchise, if you go to a stadium, if you go to an arena, you expect to have a certain kind of experience as a fan. You expect the team to play to a certain level. Tanking obviously complicates that. But Meg, do you feel like the A's and the kind of degree to which they've sunk, is this something that really we haven't seen in baseball in decades, or am I forgetting something?
There have definitely been teams that have been pretty awful, and I think that when you go on a successful run on the other end of that, we tend to forget how low the lows are. Like, some of those Astros teams during the process years, those were bad teams, but you were in a respectable ballpark, right? And it was being done, I don't want to glorify tanking, but I think it was at least being done with the idea of being good on the other end of it. This is being...
I guess what I'm asking about is just, it seems like they're letting things go to seed in a way. They want... I don't know if it's Major League or something, but it seems like they actually don't care if the fans hate them. And in some sense, it might make it easier for them to leave town.
Well, it make them easier to leave town, Josh. And it also doesn't even mean that they're going to lose money because of revenue sharing and baseball's inability to force teams that don't spend to suffer some consequences.
Yeah, I think that we have to think very carefully, especially in an expanded playoff era, about like what the low of the low can be. And I think we're seeing it now. So, this team isn't trying to win. I think you're right that there is an indifference to what it's going to look like for them. I don't know that John Fisher is particularly embarrassable. And I think that for him, as long as he's able to secure something in Vegas, he's going to look at this year as a success, even though, he is taking a storied franchise and really dragging it, in some cases literally through the mud, just based on the quality of the ballpark there. I do struggle to think of another team in recent memory that has combined this poor play with a facility that is so far below major league standard. We've definitely had bad teams before. We've had really bad teams before. And in recent memory, we have some really bad teams this year, but none of them are combining sort of this level of, uselessness on the field with such it almost feels purposeful in terms of how they are trying to distance themselves from their fans. And, it just sucks because people in Oakland have had to deal with this how many times in the last 2 decades, right? The Warriors go across the bay, the Raiders leave town, and now Oakland's on its way out, or the A's are on their way out too. So it feels very purposeful on their part. And I don't know if his assessment that he's going to find a willing and sort of ready fan base on the other side to be an accurate one. They have a AAA team in Vegas. What's going to happen to that ballpark? There's a lot of competition all of a sudden in the Vegas market when it comes to sports. It's not just like he's picking up and is going to be the first one in town. So I don't know that the A's experience in Vegas is going to be the same as the Golden Knights or the Raiders or the Aces, right? Where you have teams that have come in and either been the first one there and then been really successful and have been committed to increasing payroll and spending money. I don't know that things are going to be all that different for him. At core, he has made clear what he thinks in terms of running payroll. Why is that going to be any different in the desert, when he has to fill a 35,000 person stadium with competition in the middle of the summer? I live in Arizona. Like, it's not an obvious baseball town once you get into July and August. You really need that roof. So I don't quite know that this is going to pan out the way that either Fisher or the league wants it to. But I think that they are so keen to resolve the situation in Oakland because Oakland and Tampa and their stadium situations are standing in the way of further expansion. So I think that Manfred is highly incentivized to try to get this done however he can so that the league can move on to other markets that are going to be more appealing from a baseball perspective.
I'm glad you mentioned Tampa's stadium situation because in some ways these franchises are actually maybe the most similar in all of baseball, despite having the most kind of divergent record and maybe player evaluation systems currently. I mean, I was thinking this whole time, like Tampa has been criticized for providing a poor fan experience. People that wanted to replace that stadium forever. And I just wonder, like, and you mentioned revenue sharing too, Stefan, is the difference just that Tampa, the ownership, and I guess the people in the front office just like think winning is cool and fun? Like, because it seems like if you transplanted the Tampa ownership and front office to Oakland and still have the same crappy stadium situation and everything else, there's nothing structural about what's happening in Tampa or that market or anything that would suggest, oh, obviously there's going to be a winner here and not a winner there.
Yeah, I think that this is the great sort of tension within the sport, which is that you're really depending on teams deciding they want to win baseball games to put a remotely competitive product on the field. Now, there are some further differences between Tampa and Oakland. They don't spend a lot. They certainly don't spend anywhere near the amount that some of their AL East rivals are spending, but they have committed money. They extended Wander Franco. They did that for 11 years to try to keep him in town. So there have been a couple of differences. They sign, respectable free agents, even if they're not shopping at sort of the top of the market. But yeah, I think that the big difference is that Tampa and their front office and all of their personnel want to win. Now, the way that they go about doing that isn't to everyone's aesthetic taste. I think there's, sort of an anonymity to a lot of their roster even now that some fans find off-putting, that you can't count on those folks sticking around. And they do, especially on the pitching side, cycle through a lot of guys. They're going to have to do more of that because, I think the big thing that's going to stand in their way now is injury. But they want to win baseball games, and you see that all along the chain. And if you're going to take spending big money off the table as a means of talent acquisition, you have to be really good at the other stuff. And they are really good at the other stuff, right? They draft well, they develop, they scout well, they invest in those parts of the organization, even as the on-field product is somewhat anonymous and staffed with guys who are, pre-arbitration eligible or on, good deals. But yeah, they want to win. That's the difference between, good franchises and bad franchises a lot of the time, regardless of the payroll, is if the goal is actually to try to bring a championship to the city, it's amazing what a motivator that can be. And it feels like it should be so obvious. It feels like that should be the baseline expectation. If that's not your goal for the team, surely we have some other billionaires that we could slot into that spot and maybe get better results. So.
And maybe they've also succeeded in part because they've provided a stable experience for players who are there in terms of the coaching staff. Kevin Cash, the team's manager, I think is like the second longest tenured manager in baseball in a market that's been great on the field, but where there certainly would be no guarantees of success year to year, given the size and the size of their budget and payroll. So, I think that's it's sort of the approach that ownership takes toward caring that makes a difference too.
Well, and, I think that for the guys who are there, that's probably really important just because of how much roster churn there tends to be on those Tampa teams, right? You do need sort of a source of stability because we joke a lot about all the anonymous relievers that they cycle through, but they really do rely on a lot of different guys throughout the year to try to, cobble it together. I think that there have been years where that has been more strategy and years where it's been more necessity, but it does seem to be a constant of the roster that there's all of this churn. So yeah, you do need someone who can kind of right the ship and make sure that guys know what's what and help to get buy-in from those players, because it isn't the way that I think, if you were to ask a big league reliever, what's your season going to be like, they probably wouldn't pick all of the up and down and moving around. So I think you do need a front office and a coaching staff that can really help those guys buy in, because otherwise it doesn't work.
Meg Rowley is managing editor of FanGraphs, co-host with Ben Lindbergh of Effectively Wild. That's a podcast. She's going to stick around, and we will talk about the impact of some of baseball's rules changes so far this season. Meg, thank you for doing that, and thanks, as always, for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Up next, we'll be joined by Sarah Lyall of the New York Times, who will tell us about Buddy Holly, a PBGV, and Striker, the Samoyed. Raving on and not fading away, Buddy Holly, a dog of a breed I'd never heard of and won't attempt to pronounce, was named Best in Show at the 147th Westminster Kennel Club Dog Show in New York last week. Second place went to a Pekingese named Rummy. Winston, the French bulldog, fell in the finals for a second straight year, joining other repeat sports losers, including Striker the Samoyed and the Buffalo Bills. But really, as Westminster's judge Beth Swigert told the crowd at Arthur Ashe Tennis Stadium in Queens before awarding Buddy Holly his giant purple ribbon, all the dogs were winners. Let's listen.
Most of all, I want to thank the dogs themselves, who give so much to our lives. Whether it's here in the it's here in the show ring or in the field or even just greeting us when we come home at the door. Thank you.
Joining us now is New York Times reporter at large, Sarah Lyall. She's been part of the Times doggy blanket coverage of the event for several years. Welcome to the show, Sarah.
Hi, it's nice to be here.
Tell us a little about Buddy Holly and his breed, which even the judge referred to by its initials, PBGV, when she announced the winner.
Well, we didn't understand what she was saying. We thought she was saying CBGB, and we're like, it's some kind of punk dog breed. None of us had ever heard of it either. It's a Petite Basset Griffon Vendée, and they refer to it as PBGV for obvious reasons. It's a small hound, as far as I can tell. It's just like a cute little dog. It doesn't, it's not particularly glamorous or particularly showy or particularly even hound-like. It's just a cute dog, really.
As somebody who, you are a dog owner, Sarah, you've been covering this for a long time. Do you feel like you have developed any kind of expertise that would allow you to determine that this was the best dog, or are you just mystified when they announce who the best in show winner is?
It's really mystifying. I mean, what I learned a couple years ago, which I think is important to understand with the dog show, is it's not like a beauty contest. It's not a popularity contest. It's not like who looks like the coolest dog or the kind of dog you even think of looks like a dog. What they're judging is which of the 7 dogs in the ring in the best in show final round most adheres to the ideal standards of that particular dog. So the weirdest thing for me was a couple years ago when this Pekingese won. And a Pekingese, it's a tiny little dog. The show dog Pekingese are basically all fur. Like their hair starts at the top and goes down to the ground, and you can't even see their faces. You can't see their feet. You can basically see a mop of hair moving in a kind of weird way through the ring. And all of us watching were like, that, I'm sorry to say, doesn't even look like a dog. Like, what makes that a good dog show candidate, let alone a winner of this whole thing? And so I did a little work on, trying to understand that. And there's standards of a Pekingese breed that seem to be more perfect to that judge than all the other dogs Hi, my own dog is here right now. Yes, you're a perfect dog. The other dogs weren't as perfect examples of their breeds as that particular Pekingese. Apparently.
I like how you described the Pekingese in the Times Live blog. You said it looks like an animated toupee being propelled across the ground. It's possible that it does not have legs, but moves by some sort of levitation. I mean, all of the dogs seem sort of, some of them look like dogs and some just don't and look sort of like they were created to do this. And, your mind goes back to the Best in Show mockumentary about the way that the handlers and the owners treat these animals as less like animals and more as something special, like something out there.
Well, each of these breeds has people who love the breed to death. And, and the thing about the Best in Show mockumentary is that it's almost a documentary. And when you meet the dog show people, there's a really fine line between the parody of that movie and the reality of what these people are saying. They're all crazy, but in a kind of great way. I mean, they love their dogs. They are into this sort of thing. They're not into it to make money or even to get acclaim in any other realm outside the dog show realm. So I don't know. The more time you spend with them, the more you kind of are into it a little bit. I don't think they're ridiculous. I mean, I do think they're ridiculous, but I also think they're kind of great at the same time. And they really love their dogs. And they think of their dogs as virtually people, which I think is sort of the right way to have a dog at home. That's how I think about my dog, actually.
This is probably less of a sport than any other thing we've ever talked about. I mean, this can get into questions of philosophy that we don't have to delve more deeply into. But the description that you made of how they decide who wins, it's just like such a deeply strange idea for a competition. I was trying to think of an analogy. It's like if you put out a bunch of fruit and you're like, does that look more like a banana than that looks like a grapefruit? It's just like a weird way to compare totally different things. Like generally in sports where there's judging, you're like, all right, this person did like the hardest tricks, or this person like did the most beautiful spins or something like that. It's just it's not a typical way, or at least as far as I understand, that you would judge things.
Isn't it, though, that this banana looks more like the ideal banana than that grapefruit looks like the ideal grapefruit?
Yeah, if you have like a platonic ideal of banana, like what makes a banana to you? Is it the color? Is it the shape? Is it the size? Is it the degree of ripeness at the moment? You know, I agree. Like where is there sport in that? There's no sports related, aspect of that, except it is a competition. And that's why at the New York Times, the sports desk covers this event, which is weird in itself. But I think no one else wanted to cover it years ago. And so it just became a New York Times sports tradition.
Another kind of favorite aspect of the coverage that you do, Sarah, is you've had I think a like recurring thing, at least a couple of years, where you go and visit dogs who've like had their glorious time, whether they were the winner or the runner-up, and just go hang out with them. And I love all of the stories, even though they're exactly the same, which is the dog is just now a dog.
And the dog has no idea. But I've done it twice. So the first year I went and did the Pekingese, Wasabi, in part because we were all left so mystified when Wasabi won. Like, again, where was the dog part of this mop of hair lying in a heap on the ground and occasionally moving in a strange way? Like, that dog had to be carried into the ring because Pekingese, either they can't really walk very far or they don't want to or whatever. And all the other dogs at least make an effort and kind of jog happily into the ring. So I went and visited the Pekingese. And part of what I was trying to look at there was, why was this was like the most winning dog, not just at Westminster, but all the other dog shows that year. Like, why was this dog, who I couldn't even see its face, a champion? And I hung out with its breeder, who was so great and so funny and so interesting and had done apparently so much for the breed of the Pekingese. And he had such a great attitude. And he's, the way he described the dog, he's like, you can throw a ball for this dog, but it won't even fetch it. It'll go like sit on the ball and lie there. And it won't come when it's called. It won't beg. It won't do any work. It won't herd. It won't, carry things. It won't do tricks. It just lies around. And he's like, and I'm into it. So that was interesting.
The exact quote, which I loved from him, David Fitzpatrick, was, I don't want my dogs to do anything but enjoy their little lives.
Totally. And I said, can I see some puppies? Because he's a breeder too. And he brought out this basket of puppy. Like, I was like, how much fun is this? They're too small to like walk anywhere, I guess. And they were in a little Red Riding Hood style basket, all just sitting there. And so part of the question there was why a Pekingese? And I called some sort of dog experts. There's all these dog type magazines. Like, I don't know what they're called, but it's like Dog Today and Dogs. I don't know. And I called some of those guys and I asked them, and they said, they tried to explain it and they're like, we don't really get Pekingeses either, but here's why this counts as a great dog. So that was one year. And then this year,
Striker. You visited Striker.
Striker. I did Striker. So last year when we were sitting in the ring, all these dogs came out and we're like, we really like Striker. So Striker's a Samoyed, which are those big white fluffy dogs that are kind of like Alaskan Malamutes, but they're just white and fluffy. And they have a big smile all the time. And he was such a crowd favorite. He was like romping around. He looked really happy. And when you get some of like the terriers, or I have a terrier, but she's better than a terrier. But some of the tiny dogs, like the toy dogs, all look so dumb. And some of the dogs are so, they're just not attractive at all. But the Samoyed was like good looking. He was flashy. He was happy. And he was such a crowd favorite. And he didn't even get second place. So they do, best in show and then reserve best in show. And it was like Striker was robbed. That's what we all thought. So when I thought about who I wanted to talk to this year, I thought, let's just go see about Stryker, see how he's handled his defeat, meet some Samoyed people. So that's why I chose him.
Stryker, though, he's doing okay in retirement. He's described as a chill dog, and maybe being a chill dog is crucial to being a winning dog. Loves everything, loves going out for ice cream, just loves hanging. But he also, like athletes, he's had some sponsorship, and he did go on a little media tour after Westminster last year.
He went on a little media tour. Well, they usually get to go like on Good Morning America. They get some local press. I think the Toronto papers covered him. He was on the radio. I don't know how he handled that, but he's quite a dog of few words in my experience. And the sponsorship thing is funny, and it did feel like it was from Best in Show because they don't make any money. Like, it's so expensive to hire the people to take care of these dogs, to take them all the shows. You have to pay to enter the show. You don't get any money from Westminster. I think for there's a couple of big dog shows where you get a prize of maybe $50,000 for the biggest one. And last year, one of the funny things about Wasabi was he was a Purina Pro Plan influencer. So he's on some program, and I called Purina to see what that meant. Does he get money? Does he get whatever free dog food? And Purina got 8 members of their PR team to get on the phone with me at the same time. And I was like, what do you get from being do you get points? They're like, you get points and you can trade them for stuff. And I said, what kind of stuff? And they're like, that's proprietary information. And I remember I was sitting in the car with my husband, and I'm like, I'm not trying to blow the lid on the dog food industry here. Just tell me what they get. They wouldn't tell me. But anyway, so Stryker, I don't think was a brand ambassador or whatever, but he had some deal with a grooming company, but his owners were disillusioned because they reneged on their promise to send free shampoo. He got sponsored by a local company that makes custom-made dog booties for, little boots for dogs. And he got a special pair of boots, and he got some other thing, I don't know what else. But it was not a great retirement in terms of being set for life. But he wasn't in it for the stuff, obviously.
So they're not like horses where they go out to stud.
Well, interestingly enough, they do breed them. They might get a few $1,000. And one, I don't know if this is appropriate for your podcast. I didn't understand how I could get it in the New York Times, but they will extract semen from the dogs and use it to artificially inseminate. So I asked, what you guys would have asked, how do they do that? Do they have a magazine with sexy dogs in the pictures or whatever? And they said, no, they bring the dog to the clinic and they get some lady dog who's in heat to kind of strut by and get the male dog all excited. And then they get the sperm out and they call the lady dog a teaser bitch.
That's just
yes, they do.
That's just the correct terminology. There's nothing funny about that at all. No. How much do you see the dogs pooping? And is that does that disqualify a dog? Or are there some breeds where it's the ideal of this breed is that they will, excrete at a dog show? Who's to say? I don't know anything.
So I don't think that's a kind question to ask about dogs. The ones who are you want them always to be pooping. But they do have, I've only seen it once in the ring, they have a little pooper scooper man who just rushes in, takes it away. And it happens so fast you almost don't know which dog did it.
Wow. They're
so
ready.
Not to shame the dogs. Yeah. They're ready and right at the side, ready to go.
Sarah Lyall is a reporter at large for the New York Times and a reporter extraordinaire on the Westminster Dog Show. She's also the owner of Charlie, the Border Terrier, who joined us quietly for this segment. Sarah, thank you so much for coming on the show.
This is really fun. Thank you.
And now it is time for Afterball, sponsored by Bennett's Prune Juice, endorsed by Kenny Sailors, who says it was okay. In Sunday's blowout loss to the Celtics, a handful of Sixers had non-horrible games, among them Tobias Harris and PJ Tucker. But now that Philly's season is over, I want to say goodbye to the man with the best nickname in all of sports, Paul Reed, a.k.a. B-Ball Paul. Game 7 against the Celtics was not the greatest moment for B-Ball Paul, who put up 2 points in 10 minutes, albeit with a plus-minus of +4 compared to James Harden's -30. But anyway, it could not compare to the majesty of this moment against the Nets in the first round when B-Ball Paul got a rebound in traffic, dribbled the B-ball behind his back and between his legs, and then went up for a lefty B-ball layup. Let's listen.
From D'Anthony Melton, no good. Paul Reed between the legs.
No.
B-Ball Paul, are you kidding me?
Start calling him playoff Paul. Doc Rivers with a stunned look.
I think Doc Rivers' stunned look was the suggestion of calling him Playoff Paul when he has the best nickname of sports, that being B-Ball Paul. According to a 2021 piece in The Athletic, B-Ball Paul has been his nickname since middle school. He went on to star at DePaul, B-Ball DePaul, and won the G League MVP award for the Delaware Bluecoats. If you'd like to follow him on social media, and why wouldn't you? His Twitter and Instagram handles are not B-Ball Paul. You don't know what these check marks these days. His Twitter and Instagram handles are both B-Ball_Paul. And yes, there is a bballpaul.com, no underscore, where if you go to the product section, you're greeted by 3 pulsating rectangles, but no actual products. Stefan, what is your B-Ball Paul?
Joe Kapp, who quarterbacked the Minnesota Vikings to a 23-7 loss in Super Bowl IV in January 1970, the first Super Bowl I remember watching, died last week at the age of 85. Kapp played only 4 seasons in the NFL after 8 in Canada. The Washington football team had taken the Cal quarterback in the 18th round out of 30. In the 1959 draft, and then didn't even contact him, so he went to Canada. Classic Washington football team behavior. Kapp won a Grey Cup, and during a training camp in Calgary one year, had his throat slashed by a drunk teammate and a quart bottle of beer. Kapp's father was a German immigrant and his mother was Mexican-American. While Wikipedia calls Tom Flores the first ever Hispanic starting quarterback in professional football for the Raiders in 1960, Kapp started at quarterback and punted for the Calgary Stampeders in 1959. Reflecting the casual racism of the time, one of Kapp's nicknames was Injun Joe from a character in The Adventures of Tom Sawyer because Mexican, Native American, whatever. Kapp was remembered last week less for his play, he really just had one memorable NFL season, which I'll get to, than for his role in sports labor history. After that Super Bowl, Kapp rejected a new contract from the Vikings and was traded to the Patriots. He played the 1970 season without signing the NFL's standard player contract, which his lawyer maintained violated antitrust law. During training camp in 1971, NFL Commissioner Pete Rozelle told the Patriots that Kapp had to sign the standard contract. Kapp refused, and Patriots owner Billy Sullivan carried Kapp's bags and escorted him out of the building. Kapp, 33 years old, never played again. Kapp sued, arguing that the Rozelle rule requiring a team that signed a player whose contract had expired to compensate the player's previous club restricted player rights under antitrust law. A federal judge agreed, but a jury said Kapp wasn't harmed by the rule and awarded him no damages. Still, Kapp's case was among a few early lawsuits that 2 decades later would lead to full player rights. You can trace the ultimate achievement of free agency back to Kapp, labor lawyer Jeffrey Kessler, who helped win the decisive Freeman-McNeil case, granting free agency in 1992, said in an excellent piece about Kapp by Ken Belson in the New York Times. Kapp was a 29-year-old rookie with the Vikings in 1967, already compromised by knee and other injuries. He finished last in the league in most stats, and the team had a 3-8-3 record his first year. The next season was slightly better, 8-6, and a first-round playoff loss. Then in 1969, the Vikings sandwiched losses by 1 and 7 points with 12 straight wins. Against the Baltimore Colts, Kapp threw a record-tying 7 touchdowns. The Purple People Eaters defense allowed the fewest points in the league, and Kapp's offense scored the most. He was lionized for his ability to improvise, to run into and through defenders, and to motivate teammates. Here's John Facenda in an absolutely classic 16-minute NFL Films profile of Kapp after the '70 Super Bowl.
Pro football is more than a game to Joe Kapp. It is a demanding test for his stubborn will to win and a proving ground for his unique style. In an age of classic passers, he is the rock and roll of quarterbacks. His passes float like balloons, and sometimes he throws them with more hope than accuracy. When Kapp can't pass, he runs.
One of the writers in Minneapolis said, I look like Dagwood Bumstead trying to catch a bus, and that's how I feel sometimes. I'm trying to catch a bus.
Finesse and precision have no place in Joe Kapp's playbook. Each play is a new adventure.
A July 1970 Sports Illustrated cover labeled Kapp the toughest Chicano. The first-person story was headlined A Man of Machismo. At another point in that NFL Films piece, Facenda says, there was a fighting heart under the ribs of defeat.
The fire on the horizon is Joe Kapp, burning with the rage to win.
Poetry. I should note that Joe Kapp died after 15 years of dementia, a condition which football may have caused or to which it may have contributed. I'm aware of my own reputation and I enjoy it, Kapp said in that Sports Illustrated piece. I've been called one half of a collision looking for the other. You won't see me running out of bounds to avoid a little physical contact with a linebacker, and you won't see me ducking out the window when somebody wants to tangle. Rest in peace, Joe Kapp.
One half of a collision looking for the other. That's poetry, man.
Right? I know. You could have put that in the NFL Films piece. One other thing, Josh, about Joe Kapp that I love and kind of made me want to do an Afterball about him was that in every picture with every obit and remembrance, he's wearing a single bar face mask. Love the single bar face mask, of course.
Do you feel like the Afterball format is a proving ground for your unique style?
I do. Especially if that style involves talking about athletes from the 1970s that I remember from when I was 7 years old. Kapp in the 70s and 80s went on to have a TV and movie career. Did you know that? He was in Ironside, Adam 12, Emergency, The $6 Million Man. And I'm sure you've seen him as walking boss in The Longest Yard from 1974 and Hose Manning in Semi-Tough in 1977. And he coached Cal. He was the coach of Cal during the Stanford band game.
That was very educational for me because I didn't know much about him. I will confess and say that I mostly just knew him for his name, and it's all its monosyllabic glory. It's a great football name.
It is a great football name. You probably also remember him from the fight he had, like in 2011 with another former Canadian Football League veteran, where the guy swung a cane at him on the stage and they started brawling.
That's worth 2 points in Canadian football. That is our show for today. Our producer is Kevin Bendis. Listen to past shows and subscribe or just reach out. Go to slate.com/hangup and you can email us at hangup@slate.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the show and rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. For Stefan Fatsis, I'm Josh Levine. Remember Zelmo Beatty, and thanks for listening.